Hello and welcome to this event on the intellectual contributions of Black women to academia. My name is Kane Lewin-Turner and I'm co-convener of Race and Resistance. For those who are new, Race and Resistance is an interdisciplinary program that brings together students, scholars and activists on a non-hierarchical basis to engage in the topics of racialization, racism and connected phenomena along with the ever-present tradition of resistance. Before I hand over to our chair, Professor Patricia Daley, I would like to thank you all for joining us and invite you to engage in the rest of our program. This term, as well as continuing our discussion group, Dissident Histories, next week, we will be remembering and appreciating Bell Hooks and reflecting on the intellectual legacy of Stuart Hall on what would have been his 90th birthday. So please check the Oxford Torch website, as well as our Facebook and Twitter pages for regular updates. We're incredibly lucky to have such an illustrious panel for our first event of the year. And I'm immensely grateful for both their presence at Oxford and as well as the many insights sure to be gleaned from this afternoon. With that said, I will hand over to Patricia to begin the discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Patricia Daley. I am Professor of the Human Geography of Africa here at the University of Oxford. And I'm delighted today to welcome three Black women academics who are all based at Oxford at different stages in their careers to discuss the intellectual contribution of Black women scholars to the disciplines. This is a significant first for Oxford University. And so I am really excited and thrilled about this event. And I hope you will, some of that excitement will rub off on you. So let me introduce our three panelists today. And the first is Professor Brenda Stevenson. She's the inaugural Hillary Rodham Clinton Chair in Women's History at St. John's College at Oxford, here at Oxford. She's also Nicol Family Endowed Chair in the Department of History and a Professor of African American Studies at the University of California in Los Angeles. Professor Stevenson is a social historian whose work centers on gender, race, family, and social conflict in America and the Atlantic world from the colonial period through the late 20th century. She's published a number of books, and some have been award-winning. And I'll just mention Life in Black and White and the Contested Murder of Latasha Harlins, Justice, Gender, and the Origins of the LA Riots. So welcome, Professor Stevenson. Our next panelist is Dr. Meleisa Ono-George. She's the Associate Professor and Brittenden Fellow in Black British History at the Queen's College at Oxford. And she's co-editor of the History Workshop Journal. Dr. Ono-George is a social cultural historian of race and gender with a focus on Black women's history in Britain and the Anglo-Caribbean. She's currently conducting research for a book that focuses on the lives of several Black women in 19th and early 20th century Britain. She has also begun to develop her next project, which looks at the history of Black mothering in Britain and the politics of historical production. And she has a number of publications. Dr. Chantelle Jessica Lewis is our third panelist. She's the Andrew Pitt Junior Research Fellow in Black British Studies. She's a public sociologist, broadcaster, and event director. Her research is situated at the intersection of sociocultural analysis, politics, Black feminism, family studies, and racism studies. She co-hosts and co-founded the Surviving Society podcast, and she's Deputy Director of Leading Roots, which you can see at #Black in Academia events and campaign. So I'm delighted to welcome you all three of you. And we're going to, the format for the session this afternoon is that our panelists will speak for about 4 minutes each on an aspect of their work relating to the intellectual contribution of Black women. And we will then have questions from Kristine, who is a master's student here at Oxford, She's studying intellectual history, working particularly on prison writing and prison abolition. So Kristine and I will then ask the panelists some questions relating to their presentation, and then we will open up to the audience. So please type your question into the chat so that we can have a preview of them prior to the discussion. So you can start even now if you have questions already that you want to ask. But first of all, let me turn to Professor Brenda Stevenson, who will speak about early Black female scholars who addressed issues either historical or contemporary in the Black family. Professor Stevenson.
Good afternoon, and thank you very, very much. It is an honor to be here speaking with our audience today and with my co-panelists. We could stop here and just look at these wonderful women and the work that they are contributing to the Academy in brilliant and diverse ways. I am currently working on a book that deals with the Black family from pre-slavery times in Africa through 1860 in North America. And so whenever I do any presentation on my work, I like to begin with, and today I'll begin and end with, those persons who have come before me, those dynamic and brilliant Black women who have come before me. And so I'll start with people like Anna Julia Cooper at the end of the 19th century, people like Anna Julia Cooper, who competed with Frederick Douglass for intellectual power, Frederick Douglass as well as W.B. Du Bois for intellectual power in our society. Her work, which deals with specifically with the role of Black women in society, was very important and very challenging to many of the people who were writing particularly stereotypical and negative things about Black women at the time. And then, of course, Dorothy Porter, who was an early archivist for the Moreland Spingarn at Howard University, one of the largest and finest collections on African-American life in the United States. Dorothy Porter not only was an archivist, but she also was a scholar in her own right. And she published a great amount of work, particularly making available to other scholars edited works on primary sources on Black life. I'm going to skip really forward now, but I wanted to, of course, talk about Angela Davis and her work that deal with women, race, and class. This book in particular, I think was sort of a clarion call to people, this woman who was so important to the shaping of Black life in the United States. As for her to also, of course, she is a spectacular scholar, and to turn her intellectual might to Black women, starting with the slave era and moving forward, was particularly important. At about the same time, Black women historians such as Darlene Clark Hine, Rosalind Terborg Penn, Sharon Harley were establishing the Association of Black Women's Historians, of which I am a proud member. And this was a way of not only supporting each other in terms of trying to get our doctorates and getting jobs and that kind of thing, but also in creating intellectual agenda for the membership as well. And those groups of persons, there are many firsts. Deborah White, of course, who was the first African-American woman to write a full-length monograph on slave women. Darlene Clark Hine, who, along with Rosalind Terborg Penn, who edited the Encyclopedia of Black Women's History. Sharon Harley, who wrote a very important book on Black women and labor. Evelyn Higginbotham and Black women in the church. And it goes on and on and on. I want to mention two other people, though. One other person, and that's Margaret Washington, who's a scholar at Cornell, who has written brilliant work on Black women, both in slavery and in the political 19th century, too. But when I talk about this work that I'm doing specifically on the Black family, I want to mention, and then I'm going to yield to my other panelists, I would like to mention Joyce Ladner, the sociologist, Carol Stack, the anthropologist, and Niara Sudakasa. And the reason why I'm interested in these people and their contributions in particular is because if you know the historiography of the Black family, you know that it was really not until the 1980s that people began to give any kind of real attention to the Black woman in the family, except for to say that we were matriarchs, both in the past and in the present and the contemporary, and that, you know, the kind of control or power or presence that we had in the Black family was detrimental and not positive, and that the kinds of familial structures that were put into place were actually harmed the Black family versus helped the Black family, and had a negative impact on Black manhood and Black patriarchy, as well as Black children. And so they were people who stood up early on and said, you know, you have to look at the Black female presence in the Black family in a different kind of way. You have to look at Africa, and you have to look at the roles that Black women crafted for themselves in the survivorship of the Black family. So I'm going to stop there. And again, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Professor Stevenson. It's really important, actually, to remind us that Black women scholars have been around for some time. For those of us who are in white-dominated institutions, particularly within the UK, we tend to forget that there's been a long history of scholarship going on, starting in some of the historical Black colleges in the US and in other spaces. So thanks for reminding us about that. We're going to turn now to Dr. Ono-George, who will be giving some reflections on how Black women and womenism has shaped her research practice and is shaping studies of Britain and Empire in relation to methodology and approach. Dr. Ono-George, welcome.
Thank you, Patricia. I think, so I also want to acknowledge that I am sitting on this wonderful panel with amazing Black scholars. And for me, this is actually a first. I think it's very, trying to think if there's, I think there's only been maybe one or two occasions where I've actually shared a panel where the other panelists are Black women. And so this is amazing, I think. And I think it's really unfortunate that, well, it's not just unfortunate, it is part of our society and the inequalities that Black women are not often given credit and space in academia, not for our intellectual contributions, nor our emotional and spiritual labor. So it's really important to have spaces like this to acknowledge Black women here and those who have passed. And I'm here today as a historian who maybe is not established yet, but is becoming established in my field because of the women, the Black women that the good Lord has placed in my life. And let me just say that I'm not just talking about the important historians or scholars or theorists, many of whom Professor Stevenson has named, who have been really important in terms of my intellectual development and the field that I work in, but also women, many of whom come from a generation or a place where they have not received formal education or have never even stepped foot in a university. And I'm thinking especially here about my mother and the other mothers and aunties, a community of Afro-Caribbean women who raised and nurtured me. And the stories that I was raised and told that have been really important in terms of me becoming the kind of historian that I have become. And so I've been shaped and formed quite profoundly by the words and the stories and the imaginations of these women. And also, though, I want to acknowledge the numerous unnamed Black women that I have encountered in my journey through the archival documents, women that, according to the disciplines of history, there's not enough to write about, but who've been incredibly important, I think, in the field, and certainly in how I think about Black British history. So these are women who have made it possible for me to envision a different kind of history that is not limited by the silences and the absence of archives, but have also spoken about the possibilities of thinking about history in a different kind of way and for a different kind of purpose. And I've been thinking about how to talk about what the contributions are of Black women, and thinking about it. I mean, I think we often think about it in terms of theories. We'll, talk about maybe Black feminism or something like that. And but I think for me, the closest thing that comes to mind, maybe that describes what I'm talking about, is womenism, with its emphasis on sort of the everyday ways in which we contribute towards social justice inside and outside for formal organizations, without formalized ideologies, but a focus on sort of the thought process and the relationships, or to quote, a revolutionary kind of love. And this leads me to one of the significant ways I think that Black women are shaping the discipline of history, and certainly Afro-diasporic histories. And that is in the way that we think about historical method and production, and the care, the ethics involved in the process of making history and producing history and putting it out into the world. And so the intellectual contribution of historical scholarship is important, but it's not the most important thing. There must also be an emphasis on the process and the relationships in which history is produced, and consideration of its emotional and spiritual contributions towards social justice and change, and towards a wider community. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ono-George. That's it's really, I think, essential that we think about those the methods, because and that's something we'll take up, I think, in when we in a panel discussion, because methods and ethics are, I think, essential ways in which we can change the sort of research practice. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Lewis, who will speak on the topic of scholars, practitioners, and teachers, celebrating the contributions of Black British women to the sociological imagination. Dr. Lewis.
Thanks so much, Patricia, for the introduction, and Brenda and Meleisa. They were such great presentations. I'm so excited for the panel discussion, and I'm really honoured to be on this panel with you guys. I'm having a bit of yeah, I feel very honoured. I feel quite overwhelmed, to be honest. So yeah, bear with me. I'm going to try and keep this under 5 minutes. It might go slightly over, so we can get chatting in the panel. Anyway, right, let me start. So I want to begin by saying thank you to a friend and fellow educator and PhD researcher, Malcolm Richards, who I recorded a podcast with back in November on a show that I co-run with friends and fellow scholars, Black scholars, Tiso Regis and Georgia Fori Addo, on our Surviving Society podcast. We spoke with Malcolm primarily about Black radical education and his lived trajectory as a graduate of the supplementary school movement in London. Naturally, when we record episodes that centre the making of our Black sense of self in the context of being raised within or outside of community, we engage in conversations that praise the love and care of Black women. And of course, Malcolm shared with us how integral what Patricia Hall-Collins and what Meleisa's already mentioned, our mothers and other mothers were in the formation of his life and lived trajectory. So my first provocation, I've got about 3 short ones for my presentation. And as per many of our discussions about the formations of ourselves as Black people, focuses on what it means to be both hypervisible and invisible within our broad coalitions, while still being able to access a type of humanity that doesn't just require us to be strong, caring, and reflexive, very often in aid of others. So is that possible? So following our chat with Malcolm, he actually sent me a message and reminded me of a conversation between Bell Hooks and Stuart Hall about Black women in Britain, and on the matter of organising and the growth of feminist collectives in the 60s and 70s in Britain. Stuart Hall and Bell Hooks having a conversation in Uncut Funk. It's on page 15, and the conversation went as followed, a little bit of the snippet of the conversation. Bell Hooks says to Stuart, "Well, there were very many Black women involved. Were there many Black women involved in there, Stuart?" So on the feminist organising. A critique that I often get when I'm speaking about the various intellectuals and critical dialogues that I've had with you, and for instance, Paul Gilroy from Black Women in Britain, is They'll talk to you because you live in America, but they won't talk to us. They don't recognise us. And then Stuart said, this may be true. Who am I to say? Historically, there weren't a lot of Black women involved at the time, very few. So it's really important to caveat what I'm about to say next, is that so much of my scholarship so far has centred on combining Stuart Hall and Bell Hooks' teachings, but so much so that the theoretical direction of my PhD is centred on race, hegemony and love. But like many, I'm sure, in this call, on this call now, I'm of the opinion that Stuart Hall was wrong here. I also believe that when discussing current formations of my own discipline in Britain, that being sociology, that later down the line in years to come, there will be some people that look back at this time and say, well, there wasn't that many Black women sociologists around during that time. So how does this all relate to the academy and Black British women specifically in academia and what we're talking about today and the increased representation? So when we consider what an increased representation of Black women in institutional settings like universities means for scholarship, it's important to both locate and highlight what Black women scholars such as Jade Bentil and Francesca Saband have stressed through their work as the heterogeneous and ever-present presence of Black women in Britain. Black British women have always been at the forefront of pushing the boundaries of what is considered sociological within and beyond the academy. How I'm thinking about this in terms of the social sciences is specifically the interconnections between our creative production, both historically and within the contemporary. To name a few, I like doing this because there's so many people that always inform much how I'm thinking intellectually and creativity, of collectives that are inclusive of scholarship, work, care and creative production, of Black British women, particularly within and beyond the academy, thinking about organisations like the London-based Organisation of Women of African and Asian Descent, the Abyssindi Black Women's Collective in Moss Side, Manchester, thinking about the 2021 War in a Babylon exhibition curated by Rihanna Jade Parker, Kamara Adana and Stafford Scott, founder of the Ubele Initiative, Yvonne Field, Amara Spence, founder of the Maya Group and the Yard in Birmingham, also social scientists who have always been pushing us in terms of understandings of the racialisation of Blackness, whiteness, gender and class in Britain. I'm thinking specifically about Anne Phoenix, I'm thinking about contemporary Black British women, Lisa Palmer, April Louise Pennant, and of course, my new colleague chairing this panel, Patricia Daley. I'm also thinking about other incredible projects currently underway, led by Pat Noxolo, Tia Monique, Uzar, Rita Gale and other contributors, the AHRC funded project, Creative Approaches to Race and Insecurity in the Caribbean. And one of my favourite radio shows at the moment, the New Nationwide project, which I was listening to last night, hosted by Rita Gale, Donnelly Scott and Rita Toppin, which explores contemporary popular culture. So my final kind of provocation for this discussion, when we're talking about scholarship, recruitment, or a somewhat increased representation of Black women, more specifically in UK higher education, is how we can problematise the uncomfortable process of needing to partly engage in a nativist or nationalist framing of race in order to assert the often invisibilised, erased and co-opted contributions of Black British women in sociology and the social sciences, whilst also considering what isn't traditionally citable in academic formats, but has clearly pushed the sociological imagination with limited recognition. With all of this, I haven't really worked out where I sit, but I remain sceptical of a complete abandonment of the politics of representation when considering what remains constant is the erasure of some of these Black British women I'm thinking about. I don't think this is about a seat at the table. I think it's more about the extension or really thinking through of the politics of citation. One more provocation. Is it also possible to do all the above whilst recognising that Black feminist thought and the Black radical tradition is about the rejection of hierarchy and committed to the premise of taking everyone with us? How can we do this whilst continuously reflecting on which lived experiences matter and who is considered expendable as our university spaces undergo change? What I'm talking about here isn't me conceding to neoliberal logics, but it's more about asking challenging questions about the type of representation and exclusions we see. And look, Audre Lorde said, we're often afraid of not being heard when we do speak, And we're often afraid of not speaking, what the consequences of not speaking are. So we might as well speak on these challenging matters. Finally, I want to finish on a tweet which I read the other day. One of the War in Babylon curators and organisers, Kamara Adana, tweeted this the other day, and her words have really stuck with me. Let me just share this with you. Her words really stuck with me. Obviously, many of us can spend a lot of time critiquing what some suggest are the limited possibilities of social media in our struggles for freedom. But for me, it remains one of the places where I get to hear from Black women in particular without someone talking over us. She said, I know far too many women whose life is dedicated to everybody but themselves. They make it look easy, but we know it takes a toll. I just hope we all get to know what we deserve, to know deeply what we want and deserve outside of limited expectations for self and fear. Thank you.
Wow, thanks. That was incredible, Chantelle. And I'm going to drop the honorifics now because we're sisters. But we need those honorifics to start with, right? Because they're not often used, by others when they address us. So, thank you for these wonderful provocations. And Kristine and I are going to start with some questions, and I'm going to start with the one I had at the bottom of my list, which is about relationality. And in some ways, it's what Chantelle, it follows on from Chantelle's conversation about should we, how important is that nationalist frame that within which some of us work? Because I actually think there's a lot more. I'm a Pan-Africanist, right, by leaning. And, Brenda talks about some of how we can learn from the historiography of the family if we look to Africa as well. And we often don't. We don't, when we talk about Black British or Black African-American history, we ignore the continent, or we see these as sort of this different historical traditions. Yes, do we need, obviously we need to be alert to them. We need to be alert to the exclusions of that, that comes with the, the way women practicing in those traditions are brought into the academy. But at the same time, how do we build, relationships? What connects us? What connects the Black women we are studying? And, because I think there is actually a lot of commonalities between them. And that's what I try to do in my writing. But I just want to open it up as, part of a conversation that we could have. And then we, I'll bring Kristine in to carry on with those questions that we have. So I don't know who'd want to start with it. I mean, Meleisa, you've worked in different traditions, in North America, as well as you've done research, presumably in the Caribbean, in North America, and here. So how do we bridge, how do we avoid these silos, national silos?
So, I mean, I think, right, so my post is in Black British history, and I think that term is important for many different reasons. But particularly for the period that I'm working in, it doesn't map onto the research that I'm doing, quite frankly. And I think if you're tracing looking at the lives of Black women in the late 18th and early 19th century, which is what I'm doing, these are not women who are located only in Britain, or who, their connections are from different places and all sorts of other places. And so to say that these are only Black British women, like these are women who are only of Black Britain, is not true. They're not just Black British women, right? I think in academia, sort of having, sort of talking about Black British history and having posts like this one and some of the other ones is really important in trying to move away and to challenge I think that silence and a recognition that there is a Black British history, right? And that it isn't just African-American history, or sometimes with Caribbean history, people will talk about Caribbean as just being over there, right? It's like that sort of regional history, or that African history is just regional history, but actually that is history that is interconnected with this space as well. And so I think that there's something really important and quite political about having that term, but also recognizing that that's not in any way bounding the people that we are looking at and studying in the ways that they understood the world and their lives.
Brenda?
Well, I totally agree. Thank you very much, Meleisa, for talking about that. I mean, if you look at somebody like Phyllis Wheatley, for example, she is a person that we think of as the first Black female poet who publishes in the sort of tradition of the publishing tradition that we think of with regard to literature as well as history. But she is from Senegal, and she was actually very much influenced with regard to her publications by coming to London and speaking with people like Atepa Kuguano and, you know, Olado Equiano. And then, you know, they were the ones who really encouraged her to publish. So her life really is this diasporic life, you know, and we're also talking about empires. We're not just talking about, you know, one locale. We're not talking about West Africa versus Central Africa versus the US South or whatever. We're talking about the British Empire. We're talking about, and that British Empire, you know, changing places and spaces with, you know, the Spanish Empire and the Dutch Empire and the Portuguese empires in the Americas and, you know, and in Europe as well, and around the globe. So I think that, you know, the more that we can really focus on the lives and the experiences and the cultures of Black women as a diasporic, as these are diasporic experiences, as you say, they are Pan-African. I still love that term, they're Pan, you know, but Africa is, you know, what we're talking about, and we have to see, in some ways, you've got to give homage to that and also interrogate that experience and that history, that legacy. And I think that's really where we should be going. People have done it across the generations, but I think now many more people are doing it, which I think is really what we should be doing.
Thank you. Chantelle, do you want to come in? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in. Those are really great points. Thank you so much, Meleisa and Brenda. And I totally hear them all. I think that in thinking about the topic of the panel and in terms of the increased representation of Black people within the academy and thinking about UK academia more specifically and some of the things that I was drawing on, I think it's important just to reiterate that I very much am of the school of thought of attempting to, both in practice and in scholarship, resist nationalist framings. And I think that even think about the women that I mentioned in my presentation, like thinking about OAD and thinking about Abasindi Collective, thinking about people like Adele Jones, Gail Lewis, Ella Datsey, like these are women that based in Britain that teach us to do those things about resisting essentialism. But when it comes to these matters in practice, I do think it is important to engage in dialogues. Again, we're talking about recruitment, we're talking about the professional settings of Black women. I think it's important to engage in conversations about respectability. I think it's important to engage in conversations about who gets invisibilized, how that then plays out within our institutions. And I don't think that that it is a binary conversation. And what I mean by that is I don't think it's about not taking everyone with us. I think it remains about taking everyone with us. But what is the consistent theme when we've seen increased representation amongst people of colour more broadly across UK academia? And I think that the exclusion of Black women and Black British women in UK academia does remain an alarming matter that we do need to keep thinking about. And we can do that whilst also keeping our Pan-Africanist, collectivized, empire-focused, critical lenses on.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, but I'm going to bring Kristine into the conversation. So Kristine, do you want to pose a question to our panelists?
Sure. Thanks for bringing me in and thanks for having me here. I'd love to ask a question about positionality. We've already talked a lot about theory and relationality, and I'm wondering sort of how you view your relationships to the communities you study. This answer might vary based on discipline, especially because the methods we use in anthropology are different from the ones that we use in history, for example. But I'm wondering, how do we enter as scholars into communities? Are we in them? Are we external to them? Are we somewhere in between? And how do you view your position, and how does that inform and shape the work you do? I've been thinking about this a lot when I think about how much relevance work that Black women do has, both within the academy, but also outside of it. And so this might, maybe Chantelle, this might connect with what you're doing with your podcast. So maybe you'd like to start on this one.
Yeah, I can, thank you for that question, Kristine. I can answer this in two ways. So first of all, yeah, it's important to reiterate that I'm a sociologist. So I'm very focused on formations of race and class. And with this, in thinking about myself, I think it's really important to say that my own lived experiences, yeah, as a Black woman, and also one that has working class roots, has been really important in thinking about, yeah, how my sociological imagination has developed. But also it's important to note how I am racialized and how I am classed now as an adult. What I mean by that is I'm a middle class academic based at Oxford. To what extent am I able to generate authentic engagement with the types of conversations that I've had in the past about class? I think it's really important that I remain uncomfortable within that, as in trying to keep checking myself. And number two, I'm Black mixed race, I'm a light-skinned Black woman. It's also really important that that is centered in how I pursue scholarship, but also in the types of space, how I use spaces or do not use spaces, and what I do to uplift my cis brothers and sisters around me. I think that's really important. In terms of surviving society and what we do with positionality, I think that we try and interview a combination of established scholars, established organisers, activists, academics. We try and do this in a way that creates knowledge production that is accessible, that brings conversations from within the academy and beyond. We also, one of the key things about surviving society, and I would say my intellectual project more broadly, is that I'm very comfortable in the unknowing of social life. So I don't think I know, we should all be like this, I think, as academics, but I think it's really important to say, and hence why I called them provocations, is I don't think I'm ever settled on what I think about things, but I think it's important to say that I change my mind all the time, and I'm not an expert, I don't think. I'm just someone that really likes learning.
Professor Stevenson or Dr. Ono-George, would you like to come in on it? Yeah.
Well, I think it's really important to stay close to where you come from. I just believe that. So, I come from a town in Virginia that was 40% Black and now 65% Black. And my parents are from the Deep South, and I am derived from slave women. That's the one story that I hear all the time, is that there was an African girl sold from Virginia to South Carolina. And that was my first, that's the only ancestor that I know of truly that came from Africa. But as Meleisa said, I grew up on these stories of Black life from the, colonial period through today. And I grew up on those stories from my mother, my grandmother. Excuse me. I would not be a historian of enslaved women if it had not been for those stories. I would not have a sense of what their lives were like had it not been for those original stories in my family, and seeing how they were contested by other women in my family of their generations. And so I have a talk that I give called The Gift of the Storyteller. I gave it when I received my endowed chair at UCLA, and it is about the ways in which these women have informed us. And I take that very seriously, and I try to not allow myself to get far from those original stories that I was taught as a child, because I have my finger on that truth. That truth is stamped on my body and in my genes. And so, but the other thing that I say more practically is that I try to relate to people across race and across class and across gender, et cetera, and generation by doing public work, by working with museums, by working with, novelists, by working with poets, playwrights, et cetera, because I want them to learn what I've learned, and I also want them to continue to teach me what I need to know, to do this work. It is sometimes an uncomfortable place to be at a place like Oxford or UCLA or wherever I've been before, Yale, and say you do this work. But it also, we have to give ourselves some credit for doing the work and sticking with the work when it isn't clear that you'll get rewarded for doing the work. And so no one could have told me when I started out as an undergraduate that I was going to end up at Oxford. So I thank my ancestors, the women who told me the stories, and God for that. And it's important work that we do, and that, the ancestors have helped us to do.
Yeah, I feel like I'm getting shivers actually, just listening.
As I did when you first opened up too, I was like, okay, I feel that.
Yeah, so I feel like I could say, some of the things that Chantelle was saying and some of the things that Brenda were saying are really important. And so like the story is what you were saying, Brenda, about sort of staying, staying grounded and staying connected, I think is really important. And for me, I often think about who I'm having conversations with, like who am I trying to speak to in the work that I'm doing. And that can be really difficult sometimes, I think, when you're being pressured to produce produce work, people want you to publish things and write things for this journal or whatever, and it's in those moments that I often feel quite conflicted and pulled in different ways. And it's important that I think for me to, to ground myself and to remember what I'm doing here. And it isn't a credible position of discomfort. It's often a position of discomfort, I think. But it's also, I think, for me, recognizing that there are certain histories and stories that I cannot tell. That I could tell, but I'm not going to tell. Those are not my stories to tell. And for me, it's, I feel like I spend a lot of my time not just hiding them away because they're not for me, but actually putting them out for other people to tell. So supporting, students, like I have a number of graduate students and actually undergraduate students as well, or working with the different communities to tell those stories. And those are the people that need to tell their own stories, not me. And being really conscious, trying to be really conscious of that. Yeah. And so I feel like being so like Chantelle, I also come from a like a working class background, but I certainly cannot identify in that kind of way now. But trying to negotiate that, I am still, we're still Black women in a predominantly white institution, and having those, just sort of these constant pressures, trying to negotiate that is a challenge.
Great. Thank you, Meleisa. And I want to ask a question now, and it links to one that's in the chat. I mean, I was thinking about theory and what theories we use to frame the work. And I remember giving a talk about this, actually, about Black women in the academy. And one of the things I thought about was the extent to which Black people are theoreticians, right? Serious theoreticians about their conditions, right? And that, because in some ways we have to understand our context in order to survive, and we have to understand our condition in order to overcome them, right? So we're constantly theorizing about what's going on in our lives, and we see that in terms of the development of theory that inform our, that's coming out of Black women's political action. I can point to, womanism, intersectionality, and so on, theories that inform our work and help us to understand our situation. And I just want you to reflect a bit about your theoretical thinking, or what what comes out of the communities that that you're engaging in, which is relatively new is new to the academy, or what you bring. I mean, it could be methods, it could be the ethical thinking around methods, but also one of the questions in the chat is about feminist methodology and whether you've used feminist methodology to honor the participants you engage with as equal producers of knowledge. Because that's one of the other things, if we are saying these, the people we are working with, the communities, are developing theories, which we then take on, how do we honor them? And I know it's, trying to merge two questions there, but if any of you would like to answer that, that would be great. Who would like to start? Brenda, you're smiling, say.
Well, okay. I will try to take a stab at this particular question, which I think is a very important one. I always start by saying that I was trained as a social historian, and so I do use those kinds of methodologies when I approach my subjects. And by that, at the same time that I was being trained as a social historian, I was also being trained as an interdisciplinarian. That is, I went off to graduate school as an undergraduate and as a graduate student. Initially, too, I did African American studies, which is an interdisciplinary field. So when I approach the people that I want to learn about, of course, I listen to their voices. That is part of the social historian training that I received. But I also look at and take into consideration their other kinds of historical productions, such as their jokes, their stories, their folks' tales, the stories that were told to them when they were little, the ways in which they braid their hair, the ways in which they make their cloth, all of this, jazz recordings, all of that comes to, of course, religious affirmations and rituals, etc. I mean, all of it tells me who they are, because at the end of the day, we don't really know who they are. We're still guessing in the dark. I remember when I was writing my dissertation, I was newly married, and I was going from my home, marital home, to my parents' home, and I have to drive through Southampton County, Virginia, which is a place where the Nat Turner slave revolt took place, and it's very wooded and swampy and all these other kinds of things. And I was just trying to I was writing my dissertation, I was really trying to get a handle on resistance and all of this other kind of stuff. And it seemed as if there were these ghosts, there were these ancestral ghosts in the woods say, does she get it? Does she know it? Does she deserve to know it? Who are playing with me in this woods of the Nat Turner's, Nat Turner and his compatriots and all of that. And so, it's sort of like that. You just have to you have to go at it from every perspective that you can think of, and so that pulls me outside of, social history. And I look at, the ways in which people conduct ethnographies, the ways in which people use oral text and, delineate that and interrogate it, etc. And so, and of course, intersectionality this is all about intersectionality as well. So I think that anything you can find about, even lies about people, inform you in a certain kind of way about who they were, who people perceive them to be, who they projected themselves to be, along with the regular, autobiographical text and letters and diaries and all of those things too. But we really just have to, go at it from every perspective allowed to us intellectually and culturally, and try to find out who they are, what they felt like, what they want people to know about them or don't want people to know about them. I tried.
Thank you, Brenda. Yeah, that's true. There's lots they don't want out in the public domain.
I mean, I think that history is quite, I don't know if you've, I mean, I've heard you speak, your other talks, Brenda, so I know you sort of maybe share this, that, I mean, the discipline itself, in the way that it's been constructed, doesn't allow, I think, for it doesn't allow us to tell much about Black women's history. If we were to stay within the sort of confines of sort of, you know, this idea of history as a science and this kind of thing, I mean, you just wouldn't be able to say very much. And so drawing on a different kind of historical tradition has been really important for me. And actually, I remember when I started like undergraduate history class and being asked in one of our sort of theories and methods class what history is, and thinking to myself at the time that I was so naive, saying that it's stories, and being laughed at by some of my peers. And, you know, and then going through this whole system where it's felt like, you know, sort of the traditions of the field have been sort of, you know, sort of I've been beat over the head about, you know, these different ways of doing history and how the kind of rules and the footnotes and all that, you know, you don't have archival evidence. And so therefore you can't say this or you can't say that. And trying then to push back against that and to get, and so historians who've done that really successfully have been really important. So people like Meleisa Fuentes, like her book has been, for me, incredibly important because of the acknowledgement it has, but she is herself doing something that, you know, people talking history in the Caribbean have been doing for a very long time. And I think in other places as well, have done for a really long time, that she's drawn on a different kind of historical tradition. And so for me, that's really, yeah, so, and I mean, and part of the reason I think I can do that is perhaps because I'm beyond my PhD, right? I don't have to pass the test any longer. But drawing on that kind of creative process, I think, and the different kinds of traditions, cultural traditions that we have in terms of producing history and talking about our past is really important. And thinking about the ancestors, you know, like, I mean, I feel like people get uncomfortable if I start talking about the spiritual nature of what I'm doing, you know, like, right, but that's really important. That's really important. My family is really important from where I come from. That's really important. And also connected to that, you know, like love as something quite radical and something really important and revolutionary in the work that I'm doing is really, you know, I think is something that's not often acknowledged or accepted or is uncomfortable in academia, but is also very important if I'm going to tell any history of Black women. Pat, you need to.
Chantelle?
Well, thank you. I'll try and keep it short. Just following on from what Meleisa just said there about love. Yeah, I would say that, yeah, love is really important for my own theoretical thinking and practice and scholarship. But before getting to love, I think I, first of all, as I said in my presentation, start with thinking about Gramsci and Stuart Hall and hegemony in civil society, thinking particularly about policing the arguments and policing the crisis, but bringing that down to the micro social relations. And where I bring down to the micro social relations, I think specifically about predominantly white places and how Black people live and exist and love within predominantly white places. So that, first of all, took inspiration from Bell Hooks' essay on representing whiteness in the Black imagination, where she talks about growing up in rural America and how the actual naming of whiteness amongst other Black people in itself can be a radical act of care for each other. And I think that bringing that to the British context and what I'm thinking about in terms of white place, in particular the suburbs within the West Midlands, I draw on people like Gail Lewis and Anne Phoenix, and how powerful it is to be able to name not just how whiteness and hegemony and power are kind of consented to and operationalized within our lives, but how that is actually in itself relying on this very sticky proximity between love and racism. So I think that, again, like many Black feminists before me and Meleisa and Brenda talking as well, like so much of this stuff is but deeply personal. Patricia, as you said, I think we're theoreticians of our lived experience, but I also think that we are able to, and have always done, map these matters onto bigger concepts such as hegemony and Marxist thought. It's really important, and understanding that I think quite a lot of kind of fellow comrades, etc., say that at times, sometimes our ways of thinking about lived experience can grapple too much with a kind of neoliberal terrain and logic. And I'm very resistant of that, because I think that sometimes when we abandon an emphasis on the lived experience, like I said before in my presentation, it's always the same people who become expendable, and that is Black women. And I think that it's really important to say as scholars that we are able to do multiple things at once, as well as, so we can be theoreticians, we can be mothers, other mothers, scholars, and we can talk about Marxist thought as well. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, and thank you so much, Meleisa and Brenda. So much to think about there, and love the emphasis on the ancestors.
Thank you. We've got about 3 minutes left actually, and Kristine was going to answer your final question, but I don't think we'll have time for that. And the question, shall I just paraphrase it, Kristine, if you don't mind, was about what advice you would give young Black women scholars to, starting out. But that might be a conversation we have for another time. Yeah.
I just say one thing, Patricia.
Yeah.
Ask for help. Don't try and be a solo scholar.
Okay, 2 words each of you. Brenda, now it's your turn.
Don't expect to become rich or famous. Do it because you really want to do it, because you have a passion for doing it, and because you feel like you're called to do it.
And Meleisa?
Yeah, mine is definitely find your community, find your people.
Yeah, I agree. Find your community is essential for survival, especially in some spaces, white-dominated spaces. So I just want to thank you, my panelists, and thank you, Kristine, for joining us. Kane, I hope I'll hand you over to just say something about the rest of the term's program, if that's okay.
Well, to begin with, thank you so much to the panel, the co-chairs, for the incredible discussion. Really moving and insightful throughout, and as well as the technical support and labour from Nikki Carter and Torch. So thank you for that. But I hope the audience, like myself, appreciates the enormous privilege it was to share this space with Meleisa, Brenda, Chantelle, Kristine, Patricia. Thank you so much. And although the event is over, this conversation is not. So the revolutionary contributions of Black women to academia and beyond will constitute a kind of through line through our program, and I hope that that goes without saying. But as I said before, please check the Torch website as well as our social media pages for regular updates on our events. Next week, continuing from our discussion on Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation in our dissident histories discussion group, we'll be exploring and critiquing the cultivation of the archive and national manifestations of heritage. So if you'd like to get involved, please contact me in the link that's in the chat now. But again, thank you so much to the panel. I hope this is going on YouTube and this will become an invaluable resource for so many people. So thank you again, and thank you to the audience for joining us.